Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 120 called Charlemagne's Empire. In this and the next episode, I want to look beyond the legend to find the real Charlemagne and his achievements and failings. His legend has made him into a symbol of power and authority, as well as a figurehead for the cause of European integration. But it shouldn't be forgotten that after his death, his empire quickly broke up and his accomplishments were shown to be hollow. So what is the truth about him? Let's find out. We finished the last episode with the death of Charlemagne's father, Pippin III, in 768. Using the politically disastrous practice of partible inheritance embedded in Frankish tradition, he left his kingdom to his two sons, Charles, the future Charlemagne, who I will refer to as Charles for most of this episode, and Charlemagne. Aged 21, Charles was the elder brother, and according to the scarce sources we have available, he didn't really get on with Charlemagne. Charlemagne died in 771 from an unknown cause, which sounds suspicious, although no chronicler or historian has ever suggested Charles murdered him. Whether he did or not, his brother's death was certainly beneficial to him, since thereafter he became the undisputed king of the Franks. We have an excellent description of Charles's imposing physical appearance from his contemporary biographer Einhard. Quote, "His body was large and strong, he was tall, but not unduly so, since his height was 7 times the length of his own foot. The top of his head was round, his eyes were large and lively, his nose was a little larger than average, he had fine white hair and a cheerful and attractive face." End quote. Before I begin his story, I should explain our sources. Einhard was his only contemporary biographer, although he only knew him later in his life, as shown by his mention of his white hair. He wrote his biography, the Vita Caroli, or Life of Charles, around 820, a few years after Charlemagne's death in 814. He was a courtier at Charlemagne's court, and most historians think he penned the biography at the request of Charlemagne's son Louis. Another biography was written by Notker the Stammerer, who didn't know Charlemagne personally and wrote it in the 880s, over 60 years after his death. Only a few sections survive, so it's less useful than Einhard's biography, but it's better written and paints a more human picture of Charlemagne. Otherwise, our main sources are the royal annals, which are Frankish documents recording the king's life, his campaigns and the activities of his government, and the so-called capitularies, which are legislative documents detailing aspects of administration, law, and the management of the royal domains. So back to Charlemagne's life, the hallmark of his reign was warfare. He spent most of his time invading and subjugating the territories around the core Frankish provinces of Austrasia and Neustria. As Einhard described, quote, "In those wars he so increased the Frankish realm, which his father Pippin left to him already vast and powerful, that he almost doubled its size." End quote. Before his father's death, Charles had been fighting alongside him against the rebellious Duke Hunald of Aquitaine. When his father died on campaign, he paused to be crowned, but then continued the campaign and defeated and captured the rebellious Duke Hunald. With Aquitaine subjugated and after his brother Carloman's death, he turned his attention to Italy for 2 reasons. The first was because the Lombard king Desiderius had invited Carloman's widow, Gerberga, to his court at Pavia, where he anointed one of Carloman's sons king. This was a direct provocation to Charles. Second, Pope Hadrian I appealed to Charles for his protection against Desiderius in the time-honoured fashion whereby the popes looked to their special relationship with the Frankish king as a way of ensuring their own independence. To make matters a little awkward for Charles, he'd married Desiderius's daughter Desiderata in 770 before his brother died, and at the instigation of his domineering mother Bertrada. However, upon his brother's death, Charles renounced his mother's influence and sent Desiderata back to her father. He had, it seems, at this moment genuinely fallen in love with his future queen Hildegard, renowned for her beauty, although Charles's personal life would be complicated, with at least 8 concubines or lovers in addition to 4 successive wives, and his fathering at least 20 children. In addition, before marrying Desiderata, he'd had a relationship with a woman called Himiltrude, although historians can't agree whether she was a concubine or his first wife, who bore him his first son, Pepin the Hunchback, who would be significant later in his reign. Aside from the many women in his life, Charles's foremost interest was in fighting. In 772 he led the Frankish army across the Alps and into northern Italy, where he laid siege to the Lombard capital at Pavia. The Lombard army was formidable, and the siege lasted 19 months until 774, when Desiderius capitulated and handed over the substantial Lombard treasure. Charles had ended 2 centuries of Lombard rule in Italy, something the Pope was delighted with. But instead of reducing the Lombards to a subject race, he did the opposite by confirming the Lombard nobles in their positions and taking the title of King of the Franks and Lombards, as if the 2 peoples were equals. Even Desiderius was treated leniently and allowed to live the rest of his life as a monk in the Abbey of Corbie in northern France. For this, he won the support of the Lombards, who henceforth disappeared as an independent entity. While he was besieging Pavia, Charles had also travelled to Rome, where he celebrated Easter in 774 with Pope Hadrian. This marked the beginning of the strong relationship between Charles and the papacy, which became central to both. Some historians think Pope Hadrian even asked Charles to recognise him as the ruler of Italy, but Charles refused. Instead, he guaranteed the papacy's independence and control of the territories around Rome. In 780 he returned to Rome with his 2 young sons, Pippin and Louis, born to his queen Hildegard, and persuaded Hadrian to anoint Pippin king of Italy and Louis king of Aquitaine. By doing this, Charles used Hadrian to legitimise the authority of the Carolingian monarchs in exactly the manner Pippin III had done when he asked Pope Zachary to anoint him king in 751. The final chapter in Charles's Italian war was to secure the submission of the substantial Lombard Duchy of Benevento, which occupied all of southern Italy south of Rome except for Calabria and Apulia, which remained in Byzantine hands. In 787, Charles led a Frankish army to Capua, the Lombard capital, and the Lombard Duke Arichis submitted to Frankish rule. Thereafter, Charles allowed the duchy to remain independent, but a vassal of the Frankish Empire. By this time, Charles's focus was turning to the northern half of his realm. About a quarter of modern Germany was in the territory the Franks called Austrasia, i.e. the old Frankish heartland straddling the Rhine and including Cologne and Aachen, Tournai in Belgium, and Metz and Tertry in France. It was the territory most loyal to the Carolingians, to which the Pippinids had added Swabia, the home of the Alemanni, as well as Neustria, i.e. northwestern France, Burgundy and Aquitaine. Charles extended it further by annexing Bavaria and forcing its Duke Tassilo III to become his vassal in 787, and then confining him to a monastery in 788. The Bavarian capital of Regensburg became a Carolingian administrative centre. The annexation of Bavaria neatly complemented Charles's Italian conquests, so that the Alps were now surrounded entirely by Frankish territories to both north and south. But the main focus of Charles's reign and the object of most of his campaigns was the conquest of Saxony. Unlike the Bavarians, Thuringians and Alemanni, the Saxons were still a wild pagan people, completely distinct from the more Romanized and Christian subjects of the Frankish Empire. Saxony extended from the eastern edge of the Frankish Rhineland to the river Elbe and then to the North Sea. Its landscape was dominated by rivers and forests. The Saxons had been a seafaring people, but had moved to farming and the rearing of cattle and horses during the 7th century. There were three main Saxon political groups: the Westphalians, living between the Rhine and the river Weser, the Angarii in the Weser basins, and the Eastphalians in the Harz mountains. Saxon society was dominated by groups of nobles who lived in castles and strongholds, and otherwise consisted mainly of free men and some semi-free slaves. They were fiercely pagan and worshipped an enormous column-like tree trunk thought to support the heavens, called the Irminsul, and located next to their main stronghold at Eresburg. The growing strength of both the Frankish kingdom and the Saxons was bound to bring them into conflict, and in 772 Charles launched an attack against the Saxon stronghold at Eresburg. It was successful, and he destroyed the shrine of Irminsul and captured the hoarded treasures which lay there. It wasn't long before there were Saxon reprisals. They raided into Austrasia, burning Christian churches and pillaging the villages. Charles decided he had no choice but to invade and subjugate all of Saxony and convert the Saxons to Christianity. With the Lombard War over from 775 to 778, he focused the full might of the Frankish army on Saxony. He overran the Saxon strongholds and forced mass conversions of Saxons to Christianity. He converted the Saxon stronghold at Eresburg into a Frankish fortress and made Paderborn his centre of operations. It was at this point in 778 that Charles broke off his Saxon offensive to switch some of his army to Spain, where Muslim envoys had arrived from the ousted governor of Cordoba asking for help against the Umayyad prince who'd seized control of the Caliphate of Cordoba. Seeing an opportunity to extend Frankish power in Spain, Charles led an army into northern Spain and laid siege to the Muslim-held town of Saragossa. The city was taken and Frankish territory pushed south, at which point Charles judged it better to withdraw from Spain rather than attempt a larger reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. However, on his return through northern Spain, he incited the anger of the Basques by attacking their town of Pamplona, and when the Frankish army was returning through the Roncevaux Pass in the Pyrenees, the rearguard was attacked. The dashing Frankish commander of the rearguard, Roland, was killed, and although Einhard says the incident wasn't particularly serious and the Frankish army withdrew largely unharmed, 2 centuries later the incident was made into one of the most important and popular epic poems in the entire Middle Ages, called The Song of Roland. It tells the story of the heroic fight Roland put up against a supposed Muslim army, despite the fact it was in reality Basque, fighting against hopeless odds until he was overwhelmed. In the Middle Ages, it took on a significance a little like the Battle of Thermopylae in the ancient world, as a heroic contest between Christian and Muslim, and it became a rallying call for the crusading movement. Whatever the legend said, this minor reverse in Spain didn't bother Charles, and henceforth he concentrated his attention on Saxony and after that Central Europe. One of the reasons for this was that in 778 a charismatic Saxon chieftain, Widukind, rose in rebellion and attacked the great Frankish abbey at Fulda, which only just managed to resist the Saxons. In retaliation, Charles led the Frankish army across Saxony, subduing the rebels. However, part of his army was ambushed by the river Weser and suffered heavy losses, including the death of the royal chamberlain and 24 other distinguished Frankish nobles. This was the worst defeat the Franks had suffered in their history, and Charles was furious enough to order the beheading of 4,500 Saxon prisoners at Verden, beside the river Weser, in retribution. The Saxon massacre has been cited by some historians as a war atrocity, although I suspect this type of behaviour was fairly common on both sides. It certainly intimidated the Saxons, who in 785 finally submitted to Frankish rule. Their leader, Widukind, surrendered to Charles and was baptised a Christian. This looked like the end of the Saxon wars, and Pope Hadrian sent congratulations to Charles in 786, saying he was the king who, quote, with the help of the Lord and through the intervention of Peter and Paul, had bent the necks of the Saxons to his power and authority and led their entire nation to the holy font of baptism, end quote. However, this congratulation was premature, since the third and final phase of the 30 Years' War with the Saxons began in 794, with a new and even more brutal rebellion than before. One of the reasons for this was that the Saxons hoped a new enemy might overthrow the Franks, and these were the Avars. You'll recall from episode 104 how formidable an opponent the Avars could be when they launched their great assault against Constantinople in 626. The capital of Byzantium only survived because of the Emperor Heraclius's careful preparations for the city's defence and the garrison's valiant resistance. It's therefore testimony to the strength and effectiveness of the Frankish army that it managed to all but eliminate the Avars. This began in 788, when the Bavarian Duke Tassilo appealed to the Avars for help against Charles's annexation of Bavaria. Both Avars and Franks prepared for war. The Avars had heavily armoured horse archers as well as large numbers of foot soldiers. Charles didn't underestimate the threat they posed. At the Bavarian capital of Regensburg, he mustered a large Frankish army for what Einhard called, quote, the greatest of all the wars waged by him after the Saxon War. He managed it with greater vigour and a larger preparation than his other wars, end quote. This war lasted 8 grueling years, from 791 to 799, and during it, in 794, Saxony erupted into rebellion yet again, causing Charles to give his son Pippin command of the Avar War while he focused on the Saxons. Pippin managed the Avar War well. In 796, he dealt them a fatal blow when he captured the Ring, an enormous fortified encampment containing a hoard of treasure, probably most of it taken during their many wars with Byzantium. Again, Einhard has left us with a vivid description of the Frankish triumph. Quote, how many battles were fought, how much blood was shed, is attested by the state of Pannonia, left empty of its inhabitants, and the place where the Khan of the Avars was, is left so deserted that there's scarcely a trace of any human dwelling there. The whole nobility of the Avars perished in that war, and all their glory ended. End quote. Einhard describes the immense riches the Franks seized when they found the Avar treasure hoard. Quote, all the wealth and treasure that they, i.e. the Avars, had assembled over many years was seized. Human memory cannot record any war against the Franks that left them richer. End quote. While the Avars were all but annihilated by one Frankish army, another was doing the same to the Saxons, who'd revolted once again, hoping the Franks couldn't fight on two fronts at the same time. As mentioned, Charles took personal command of the Saxon war, leaving his son Pippin to fight the Avars. By 797, he'd re-established his control of Saxony and based himself in a new fortress in Saxony at Hechstelle. He strengthened Frankish control of Saxony by deporting some of the Saxons to France, while appointing a new administrative government in Saxony composed of his own counts, together with Saxon converts who could be trusted. He ordered the codification of Saxon legal customs in a written law of the Saxons, and Einhard rather optimistically declared, quote, "United with the Franks, the Saxons came to form with them a single people," end quote. By 800, Charles had completed most of his conquests and, as Einhard said, nearly doubled the size of the Frankish Empire. What was the secret of his success? Besides his strong leadership and military skills, it was the Frankish army which delivered victory. Unfortunately, we know disappointingly little about it. Historians have estimated its size as anything between 5,000 to 100,000 soldiers. My sense is that it must have been somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000, since Charles fought simultaneously on two fronts for much of his reign. For example, against both the Arabs in Spain and the Saxons, and then against both the Avars and Saxons. The Frankish army prevailed in all of these wars, although admittedly the one against the Arabs was the least successful. However, the virtual annihilation of the Avars showed the Franks could achieve what the Byzantine army had failed to do. Horsemen were an important part of the Frankish army, and we can safely assume they were the strike force that achieved victory in most battles. They were the forerunners of the Norman knights who were to prove so successful in the First Crusade and the Norman conquest of England. Wearing chainmail and with conical iron helmets, they would have been equipped with swords and spears and probably round shields at this stage, rather than the famous kite-shaped shields of the Normans, which were copied from the Byzantines at a later date. We also know their military equipment was good. As I've mentioned before, the quality of Frankish swords was legendary. So was Frankish chainmail. Indeed, such was the popularity of Frankish swords and chainmail outside the Frankish Empire that in 779 Charles forbade their export. Notker the Stammerer has left us with a vivid description of the iron-clad army with which Charles invaded Italy. Quote, "Then could be seen the Iron Charles with an iron helmet, his hands clad in iron gauntlets, his iron breast and shoulders protected with an iron breastplate. The fields and open places occupied by his army were filled with iron. The rays of the sun were thrown back by the gleam of iron." End quote. As for the organisation of the army, we know from the capitularies that traditionally there was an annual gathering of every freeborn Frank who was required to attend for military service. However, Charles tried to professionalise the army so that a corps of battle-hardened volunteers rewarded with pay and the prospect of plunder formed his standing field army, while other freeborn Franks were allowed to farm instead of fight, provided they made monetary contributions to the army. The prospect of plunder, attested to by the legendary wealth of the Avars, meant there was no shortage of recruits for the standing army. In AD 800, Charles was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III. Henceforth, he would be known as Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. It was a fitting recognition for nearly 30 years of warfare and victory over the pagan Saxons and Avars. But his empire would not last. As the 9th century dawned, new enemies of the Franks would appear, ready to shatter Charlemagne's fragile empire and transform Western Europe once again. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll continue with Charlemagne's reign on the 11th of October. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.